Welcome, everybody, to this webinar, where we'll be exploring tools that can be used in advocating for people with advanced breast cancer to improve the access patients have to the medicines they need. We'll be focusing on the situation in high-income countries, where medicines may be approved but not always funded, and often with deadly delays. I'm Anna Wagstaff. I'm a health journalist with a special interest in everything that has to go right to get patients access to the treatments and care they need, and I'll be chairing. As we're going to hear, the barriers to access are many, they involve different stakeholders, and they operate at different levels: international, country, hospital, and even individual doctor. So to overcome them, you'll need to work with allies and focus your efforts where they're most likely to be effective. Think of it as targeted or precision advocacy. To help guide us through what that means in practice, we have a panel brimming with expertise from the world of the clinic, advocacy, and pharma, who I'll introduce in a minute. The most important people here, however, are you, our audience. You'll already be familiar with many of the barriers to access faced by patients in your own countries, and no doubt have some experience trying to get around them. To ensure you get the opportunity to question the panelists about how to apply what they are saying to the specific issues you face, we are reserving 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So a quick word on how you can ask your questions. You can use the chat to ask questions and also to share comments. Please do use it. We need to hear from you. We have someone checking out the questions as we go along. If your question is aimed at a particular speaker, please make that clear. It could also be helpful for you to say where you are from. Now, let me introduce all the speakers. You can see their names on their respective feeds on your screen. First up will be Fatima Cardoso, a consultant medical oncologist. Fatima is the one person on this panel who I know needs no introduction. You will know her as the founder and president of the ABC Global Alliance and the ABC International Consensus Guidelines, and a lifelong champion of improving the lives and outcomes for people living with advanced breast cancer. Fatima will start by setting the scene. What do we know about the extent of inequality in access to medicines, both between and within countries, and even between hospitals in the same area? Next up will be Christel Jansen. Hi, Christel. Christel is the founder of the delightfully named Access Embassy, which advises life science companies and global health organizations on access and policy. She's been a policy advisor to the Dutch Ministry of Health, amongst other roles, before moving into pharmaceutical strategy consulting a decade ago. Christel will talk through how the barriers to accessing ABC medicines have changed from the 1990s until today. And she'll ask, what does that mean for today's advocates? Where should they target their efforts? And what alliances can they make to have the greatest impact? She has some clear and helpful advice. We then have Mihai Rotaru. Hi, Mihai. Mihai is Director of Market Access at the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries, EFPIA. EFPIA has done a great job documenting how delays and differences in access decisions play out into inequalities in access between EU member states. It's made a series of infographics where you can see how your countries compare with others, which you can use as part of your advocacy. Mihai will talk us through the route a drug travels from the point it is authorised by the European Medicines Agency to when it reaches patients. And he'll talk about the potential delays associated with the different phases, and he'll point you to some useful tools to help you make the case for changes that could help overcome those delays. After Mihai, we'll hear from Kirstin Spencer. Hi, Kirstin. Kirstin is a highly experienced patient advocate living with metastatic ER-positive lobular breast cancer, who works across cancer research, clinical trials, health technology assessment, and healthcare policy in the UK and internationally. She will offer some invaluable advice on how advocates can convince the people that matter to effect meaningful change. It's not about being the loudest person in the room, she will argue, but about understanding the different pressures that different stakeholders face, building relations, and being persistent. Frankly, it's a huge ask given what patient advocates have at stake and the unfairness and the urgency of their situation. So we're really delighted to have Kirstin here to talk us through how to do that. And then it's back to Fatima again. who will look specifically at what clinicians can do to improve access to the appropriate medicines for advanced breast cancer for all patients who need them. This means speaking out when you're unable to provide in full the recommended treatment. It also means asserting your voice at hospital, national, and international level, which can mean leaving your comfort zone, but it's got to be done. And Fatima is a great role model. So let's get started. Fatima, you have 5 minutes to tell us about unequal rights for ABC medicines in high-income countries.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar. So in 5 minutes, I will explain the whole problem of unequal rights in access to medicines in high-income countries, following up from the other webinar we have done about the situation on low-middle-income countries. So I'll come back to the ABC Decade Report and what we have found very briefly. In terms of survival in the last decade regarding advanced breast cancer, we have seen that the 5-year median overall survival, so that is percentage of patients alive at 5 years after diagnosis of metastasis, we went from 26 to 33%. Still painfully slow, but better than the decade before, where we went from 24 to 26. We also saw the development and approval of new targeted therapies that have changed and improved substantially the survival of 2 of the 3 subtypes, HER2 positive metastatic breast cancer and ER positive, HER2 negative, or endocrine dependent advanced breast cancer. We also saw the development and establishment and use of important and high quality guidelines. However, we see that the survival improvements are very uneven. For example, for triple negative advanced breast cancer, we remain at 13 months. We have no improvement. And also what we see in clinical trials doesn't always translate to real world settings. And even the access is very unequal, and we'll come back to this. In high-income countries, we have 2 major issues. We have frequent shortages of older, inexpensive medicines, and we have problems of access to innovative, expensive medicines. In terms of older, inexpensive medicines, these are the ones that are classified by WHO as essential medicines. And this is because they are used at some point of the disease by the vast majority of cancer patients. And why do we have shortages? Because these are already all generics and biosimilars, and many of the manufacturers discontinue production, and I don't have the time to go into the reasons for that. But just to give you some examples, Portugal was without tamoxifen for 5 months and 6 months in 2023, 24, and 25. So if we don't have tamoxifen, how can we treat premenopausal patients? It's very complicated. The manufacturer of goserelin has stopped or announced that it will stop producing the monthly injections in New Zealand, Australia, and probably in the UK and Canada. Again, another problem for young women with advanced disease. And some supportive medicines, for example, dexamethasone, which is the steroid important for brain metastasis, is often missing. We can't find it. So this also leads to inequalities, because among the high-income countries, those who can afford to pay more will have the little production of these medicines that exist. Now, moving to the innovative, expensive medicines, I showed you that they can drive important survival gains, but the time to reimbursement, and you will hear more in detail, varies widely from 53 days in Germany to more than 900 days. 900 days is a time that metastatic patients don't have. And sometimes when the drug is funded, the biomarker, the target of the drug, it is not funded, and it's out of pocket. And this out of pocket leads to inequalities. Is these inequalities in access linked to survival? This is an old study, but it would be the same if I would have a graphic of a more recent one. You see these clusters of countries. These are within Europe. And you see this red cluster with lower survival. These are Eastern European countries. So lack of access leads to worse survival. And if we want innovation to be important, it has to be accessible. So in access to care, what we saw in the report, it was the only goal where we didn't have major advances. On the contrary, we have more inequalities today than we had 10 years ago. And this is because not just between high and low income countries, but within each country and within each high income country, we have different access. And this can be because of public and private, but it can also be because of a substantial proportion of out-of-pocket expenses. So these three levels of inequity is what we need to discuss in high-income countries. At the country level, between approval centrally and then reimbursement at a country level. Within the country, between public systems, private systems, and in the private system, according to your level of insurance. And then at the individual level, not everybody has access to multidisciplinary specialized care. Not every case is discussed at the tumor board. And unfortunately, not every patient receives evidence-based, guideline-guided treatment, even if the drug is reimbursed. And we have new data from the Naomi registry in the UK showing that a substantial proportion of patients who would be candidates for a CDK4/6 inhibitor does not receive it. And finally, just the call of attention that a while ago at the EBCC manifesto, we asked this question: why are European patients not receiving the best care? And if you read this manifesto, you will see a lots of examples that the 85% of the reasons are financial. And this is because the reimbursement rules have not evolved as the science has evolved. And we continue to, the hospitals continue to be paid more if they do IV treatments as opposed to oral or subcutaneous, and if they do longer radiation treatments, for example. So reminding all of you of the new charter moving forward, and today we'll be focusing on this accessibility, not just to medicines, but to high quality care, multidisciplinary, evidence-based, supportive, including palliative care. So I'll stop here and give you the QR code if you want to read more about the decade report.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Fatima. Now on to Christel Jansen. She has 11 minutes to explore the question, why are we waiting and what can we do about it? Christel.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Super. And I can also control the slides. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for having me. I am Christel Jansen, and also thank you, Anna, for the wonderful introduction earlier. No need to add anything else. Just that it's a real pleasure to be here with you today to talk about access policy, and in particular, why are we still waiting for access to innovative therapies in advanced breast cancer, even in high-income countries, and what can we do about it? And what I would like to do is to take you back over the past 30 years and show how the reasons for patients waiting have really shifted over the past 3 decades. Because if we understand how the barriers have evolved, then we can also start thinking differently about how we overcome them. So let's start in the 1990s. And like for many of you, breast cancer is also personal to me. This was the era in which my mother developed breast cancer. In her case, she found a lump at just 30 years of age. And following a delayed diagnosis, her cancer had metastasized by the time it was recognized. And she passed away less than a year later. And looking back with today's knowledge, it was most likely triple negative breast cancer. And I share this story because it illustrates that at the time, the biggest barrier wasn't exit policy yet. It was more the science. We simply didn't understand breast cancer like we do today. The triple negative breast cancer wasn't yet recognized as a distinct subtype. The HER2 biology was only beginning to emerge, and precision oncology didn't exist. The treatment was still largely based on one-size-fits-all chemotherapy, with therapy also available, but only for patients with hormone receptor positive disease. So as a result, in this era, the outcomes were poor. Around 1990, only about 1 in 4 women with metastatic breast cancer were alive 5 years after diagnosis. And survival had also hardly improved during the previous decade because this innovation was still very limited, as I just mentioned. So that's why the 1990s were fundamentally different. The question wasn't whether patients could access innovation, it was whether innovation existed in the first place. And that also makes the next era so important, because then that was where the scientific breakthroughs started emerging. It already started in 1998 with trastuzumab, and that was the start of a series of scientific breakthroughs that really changed what became possible in cancer care. So that's the era that I call the economics era. And that's where precision medicine really became a reality. We saw the arrival of the SERDs, the antibody drug conjugates, the CDK4 inhibitors, the PARP inhibitors, the PI3K inhibitors, and also in 2020, the immune therapies, and more recently, the oral SERDs, SERDs. And these breakthroughs were very much supported by decades of scientific progress, but also by regulatory frameworks and incentives that we know today. But it also created a new challenge, because countries were now starting to ask, can we afford this? And that brought the health technology assessments, the value assessments, the cost effectiveness assessments, and also the international reference pricing, all to the center of exit policy, especially in Europe, where countries also increasingly started to benchmark each other's prices. And as a result, during this era, the pricing differences between the EU and the US also became more pronounced. But the good news during this era is that despite the emerging and increasing economic access barriers, these innovations have really transformed outcomes for many patients with advanced breast cancer during this era. So between the early 90s and the period from 2015 to 2021, that Fatima also just referenced, the 5-year overall survival for metastatic breast cancer increased from around 23% in the science era to 33% in this era. And the median overall survival increased with almost a year, with 11 months. Then we entered what I call the geopolitics era, and that is actually what's going on today. Just as we have sort of adapted to the economic realities, and we know how to talk about these economic barriers in our advocacy efforts, the ground shifted again by the end of last year. And that's why I think that today we're entering the third era, where access is increasingly shaped not only by health policy or economics, but also by geopolitics. And in the United States, we now see the arrival of the most favored nation pricing policy that you may and probably have heard of. So that's the policy where the US now also intends to benchmark US prices to the prices across the different programs, 19 other countries worldwide. At the same time, we see in Europe, and that's important to know because at the moment, the US is a key driver of global innovation. So roughly in the US, prices are around 3 times higher than in Europe, for example. And because of the size of the country and the prices, the US tends to account for around 45% of global pharma revenues. So it's a very important market for pharmaceutical companies to continue to drive innovation. At the same time, the EU has introduced the general pharmaceutical legislation that is currently being finalized, where it intends to decrease inequities within Europe and also introduces some launch obligations for pharmaceutical companies who received the European marketing authorization. So what we see consequently is that the US and the EU are pulling in different directions. And individually, both of these policies sound very reasonable, but together they create a powerful system incentive. Because what the US is saying is if you launch in Europe at prices that are lower than in the US, this will affect prices in the US, which is a key driver. So in this system, there's nobody to blame. I think it's good that the EU aims to address inequity. The US aims to address the imbalance. Pharmaceutical companies aim to optimize innovation. But together, this creates strong incentives that in the end boil down to patients risking to wait even longer. Because companies may delay or avoid launches outside of the US because of the higher risk involved. And that means that access to innovation as we know it today, which is already very concentrated in high income countries, may concentrate even further. And that means that the ambitions, as also outlined in the decade report, are at risk. The aim of achieving 100% 5-year overall survival for metastatic breast cancer and 60 months median overall survival for de novo metastatic breast cancer. So where does this leave us today? As mentioned, it's good to know your barriers because it affects your advocacy policies. And every era creates a new barrier and response. So in the 1990s, the innovation was the key driver. In the economics area, it was evidence on the value of therapy that was a key driver of change. But in this era, I believe that it's really the coalitions that drive it, but somehow it doesn't. Sorry, there was a delay. So because access is no longer determined by science or value alone, it's increasingly shaped by broader policy decisions that actually go beyond any single stakeholder's control. So when policy becomes the barrier to access, I believe that it's also the patients and the clinicians here with us in the virtual room today that must become part of this policy conversation and find new arguments of making the case for patient access. And within these coalitions, every stakeholder has their role to play. So patients bringing the lived experience, clinicians providing the clinical experience, industry advancing innovation and working across the ecosystem, research is generating the evidence, but also finding politicians that are able and willing to amplify the voice of advocacy groups. So lastly, what does this mean for unlocking access as a coalition? So first of all, I believe that attention is the scarcest commodity in today's world. So we need to build bigger coalitions so that voices are unified, and also win the political champions just mentioned, the supportive policymakers that they can join the conversation early and help to target the right audience. Align on the facts so that there is one common narrative on what the situation looks like, and also humanize the debates. So shift the focus from affordability to demonstrating the human costs of delayed access and fighting the right battle. They're a nice example of how the Cancer Drugs Fund emerged. where all of these factors played a role. So I'm happy to share this afterwards offline. But one key factor was fighting the right battle. So no longer advocating with the usual audience, but actually find a new political audience that can create room. And in this case, now that everything is about geopolitical competitiveness, it also becomes important to position innovation in oncology within this whole debate of economic competitiveness and innovation. So I think I was 30 seconds over time, but I hope this gives you a good overview of where we are, what the barriers are, and also some hope for adapting advocacy strategies accordingly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Christel. That was fascinating, and thanks also for pointing us in the right direction, because it can be quite intimidating when advocacy means intervening at a geopolitical level. So that was interesting. We are kind of running short of time. We're slipping a little bit. So let's go straight on to Mihai Rotaru from EFPIA, who will speak about tools from pharma that can help improve access in Europe. The next 11 minutes, Mihai, are all yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. So what I'm hoping to do in the next 10 minutes is to dive a little bit more into the detail on a more systematic manner in terms of cataloging the hurdles that we see from our perspective, but also to outline some of the proposed actions or proposed solutions that we take as an industry to help mitigate. So I think a lot of the things that I will talk about or I will show you are not going to be any surprise to any of you. I think it's a lived experience for all of you. When I say that the medium time to availability is varies quite significantly. I think Fatima also mentioned it in her introduction, but we are really talking about an order of magnitude of between maybe 2 months to 3 years in the very let's say extreme cases. And I have to say this is also an average, or better yet, it's a median time. So it means that there are very much examples where these numbers are much higher, while at the same time there are examples where medicines are available quicker. But still, it paints a rather unflattering picture, if you'll allow me to say so. But beyond the time, it's also a matter of how many products are available in a specific country for patients in general. And here on this slide, I'm also trying to show the gradient, if you will, from more Western European countries to more Eastern European countries in terms of like the absolute number of medicines, of cancer medicines available on the specific markets. And I think it's not mentioned here, but at least the 100% is supposed to represent 52 medicines, and you can see the gradient going down. But what's also interesting, and it's a data point that we have collected, and we do see that the situation is increasing as we go through time, is that, and you see it here on the slide, there are more and more countries and medicines where medicine types where the medicines themselves are available only on a limited availability basis. So this can mean restrictions to subpopulation basis or any other reason. So it's not really the full intended to treat target population that has access to these medicines. Now, why this happens? So I promise that I try to walk you through some of the reasons why this happens. So I think, again, maybe to follow from Christel's geopolitical presentation, there is one European regulatory approval, but unfortunately, there's still 27 different market access decisions. So when we talk about Europe in healthcare, it's one of those things where it's glass half full, but also glass half empty. Because on the access side, we still face a situation where companies need to navigate 27 different market access systems and circumstances. But what a lot of them have in common, and this is also here on the slide on a catalog, you can divide it into a number of, let's say, areas. Ranging from preparation to submission and application. So here you have, of course, the HTA dossier, the company application, then the appraisal phase, in terms of the full HTA, but also in some markets, maybe cost effectiveness analysis and budget impact analysis. And that leads to hopefully a recommendation for reimbursement. And then there's still the dark art section of pricing and reimbursement, where you have a number of other elements that come into play when it comes to willingness to pay, ability to pay, unmet medical need, all of these discussions that coalesce around whether or not a country reaches a positive decision. But even if a country reaches a positive decision, so there is reimbursement on a positive reimbursement list, that still doesn't mean anything if patients don't have access to the medicine. So then we're moving on more towards the inequalities at national level, as Fatima tried to cover them in the beginning, because there might be situations where the clinical guidelines may not be updated, the prescription is not to the level that we would expect, maybe the infrastructure, the healthcare infrastructure is not in the right place. There might not be access to biomarker testing. There might not be access to specialized treatment centers, and so on and so forth. On a more detailed basis, and this is where I wanted to cover more of the presentation on some of the key factors that we observe. And I think here I would like to pick up on Anna's introduction when she said that all things have to go right before a patient has access to medicines. And unfortunately, that statement of all things, it actually leads to, is actually underpinned by by quite a large number of possible barriers that need to be overcome in their totality for access to actually happen. And here, I think it's not going to surprise any of you when I say that on a process level, obviously, you might have undefined timelines, you might have multiple layers. So here I'm talking about countries where there's a national decision, but then there's a regional decision on access as well. So you have your Italy's, Spain's, and Sweden's of the world. Maybe you have a late start of the process. This tends to happen more often in Eastern Europe, where you have external reference pricing, which immediately forces you as a company to seek reimbursement in other markets, multiple layers I've mentioned. And then you move on to the reimbursement criteria. You might have different requirements, different acceptability of data between countries, even though you as a company have developed your clinical trial on a global perspective. It might not lead to acceptance by all HTA bodies. You might have evidence gaps in this respect. Each country might have a slightly different way of thinking and looking at the data that is needed for reimbursement. And I should be even more precise here to say different countries might have a different affinity to acceptability of uncertainty. This is where the rubber hits the road in a sense, and you have some countries that require more and more and more and more evidence, and that inevitably leads to a timeline delay. And then obviously the misalignment on price and value. On the on the health system readiness, clinical trials I've mentioned earlier, suboptimal healthcare infrastructure, I'm not going to cover again. Of course, budget restraints, that's something that we know very well. But the budget restraints conversation, for example, leads us into a situation where you have subpopulation restrictions in access. But what I'm trying to say with all of this is that the factors are multifactorial. So all the root causes are multifactorial. You have cross-country variations. They tend to be interdependent, and they do require a pluri-stakeholder engagement. And I think we're going to cover that in a second. On the industry side, what we're doing is, of course, we're working across with all our members from a global perspective, and we are aiming to reduce the regulatory approval timelines in Europe compared to other jurisdictions. We have launched this European Access Hurdle Portal, and I will have a link to that in the additional resources slide. That's a very interesting report for all of you, because we are asking members to really pinpoint what are the concrete reasons why they have not launched in market X or Y or Z. And you can see that the variation between what's expected and what is possible as a reality varies very differently between various countries. We talked about misalignment of pricing and value. I think here, this is where we are discussing about possible novel pricing and payment models. So we're talking about outcomes-based agreements. We're talking about the so-called famous Netflix models. There are areas where certain specific arrangements can be found. HTA, I think this is quite something that everybody knows, especially with the establishment of the European Joint Clinical Assessment and of which the first report was published 2 weeks ago. And then we also talk about a conceptual framework for equity-based tier pricing, by which we mean an ability for companies to engage in more, let's say, pricing negotiations that take better into account the ability to pay for countries. And beyond that, and this is a newer concept that we're working on, we would also like to move Europe, if you will, or all 27 member states towards a system where medicines are available on day one after marketing authorization. But so they are available to patients, but then the pricing and reimbursement negotiations happens in the background in parallel. So that would immediately move the first slide that I showed you to zero in terms of patient access, and then you would still have the timeline for negotiations varying between 2 months and 3 years. But that's definitely something that we as companies see that at least there would be no need to wait for patients across the EU to wait for their medicines while all the other root causes are being navigated. Last but not least, obviously at the EFPIA we do have a patient think tank, so we work closely with patients and especially patient organizations more on a European level. So we discuss a lot of these things. We discuss also other broader topics such as clinical trials engagement. We talk about regulatory approvals and so on and so forth. And we're happy that we are able to gather this, let's say, close perspective from patients. But I would say, to take this one step further, I think the more we as industry can integrate patient perspectives, the better it is to make the case at national level towards decision makers. But it also goes the other way around. The more patients advocates make the case towards decision makers at national level, the better the two let's say lines of communication meet, and then national decision makers have the ability to reconcile the perspective of companies versus the perspective of patients. And I will close with the additional EFPIA resources. So these are all links. You'll receive the slides afterwards. I do encourage you to at least flick through. I think, as Christel said, it's important to have the same diagnosis, and it's important to have the detailed information as to where we are. And I think earlier introduction was also mentioned that it's interesting to look at your neighbors, if you will, between countries. It's always interesting to benchmark where your neighbors are. And I think at least from an EFPIA perspective, there's a lot of wealth of information in these reports that can help you to take a more, let's say, targeted approach when it comes to your engagement. So I'll stop here, Anna. I'll look at this chat. I think there are some questions, but then I'll participate in the overall discussions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for getting through all that level of detail in the time that you had, or almost in the time that you had. We're still lagging behind a little bit, so I'm absolutely delighted now to move on to Kirstin Spencer, who will address the question that I'm sure many of you have been asking. How do you make your voice heard? You've got 9 minutes, Kirstin.
Hello there. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'll get straight on with the presentation. So patient voices can make a real difference, but their influence is rarely accidental. It comes from understanding how systems work and learning how to engage with them effectively. And I think this slide shows all the many charities that have supported me and developed me as an advocate, and many patients are unaware of the opportunities that exist to build the knowledge, skills, and networks needed to engage effectively in advocacy. I've always been involved in charities, and my own advocacy training began with the Alamo Scholars Program at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium in Texas. The following year, I attended the National Breast Cancer Coalitions Project LEAD in San Diego. And this year, I was honored to be selected for the American Association for Cancer Researchers Scientist Survivor Program. I've advocated from Capitol Hill in Washington to DC to the Palace of Westminster in London. And all these experiences, together with the guidance of excellent mentors across the UK, Europe, and the US, have been instrumental in developing my advocacy. So I think we really do need to understand as patients what happens when systems work and what happens when they do not. Some of the most powerful advocacy comes from not only sharing personal stories, but from combining lived experience with evidence, relationships, and a deep understanding of how decisions are made. So patient advocacy is not just awareness campaigns, it increasingly influences drugs approvals, national health policy, clinical trial design, national cancer planning, parliamentary discussion, and in America it influences research as well. Most systems say they want patient voices, but the real question is, and what we will consider today, is what actually makes institutions listen. So what doesn't work and what does? Well, I have to say, outrage alone rarely changes systems. And social media visibility should not be confused with credible influence. So I found that institutions tend to respond to evidence, credibility, persistence, relationships, and constructive engagement. You must build trust with them. And as patients, we are able to do this in majorly different ways. I mean, there's something that everyone can do. We can be sitting on advisory boards, we can participate in guideline development, we can join research steering groups, we can contribute to medicine approval processes and research to help design patient-friendly studies, because sometimes what doctors think is tolerable side effects might not be what patients find tolerable. We can identify barriers to recruitment and advocate for research that reflects real-world populations. And when we can start asking questions such as, what practical steps would improve access? Who needs to be involved? What evidence is required? How will success be measured? And this starts moving the conversation from frustration to action. So being heard is not about being the loudest person in the room, but it's about becoming useful to the room. Now, inequity, I'm afraid, a major focus of modern inequity, and it's worldwide, and that's a major focus at the moment of our advocacy. Patients may not control the system, but we can help change it by bringing evidence, experience, persistence, and partnership to the table. So one of the things you have to bear in mind is that the most powerful patient voices are not those that simply describe the problems, but they are those that help build the solution. So we know that patients often experience very different opportunities to clinical trials and treatments depending on where they live, how much money they've got. And advocacy groups and organisations have helped highlight inequities such as genomic testing access, meaning that if you don't have it done, you can't access the medicine that you need, specialist imaging access, clinical trial availability, access to innovative medicines. So though we cannot fix this systemic inequity alone, we can be powerful agents of change by helping bring issues to the attention of decision makers. Now, decision makers do need statistics, but our patient experience often reveal problems that routine data misses, such as delays in diagnosis, postcode lotteries, barriers faced by poorly served communities. And we can also demonstrate the real-world impact of policy decisions. So I really think it's worth joining an advocacy organisation or charity and building alliances with clinicians, researchers and nurses and other patients rather than working alone, because a united voice is often harder to ignore. Systems are just more likely to respond when they see that a problem affects many people and not just one. So some of the things patients can do, as a patient expert involved in committees deciding drug approvals, medicines access, I believe, is one of the clearest examples of patient influence, which provides context that clinical trial data alone cannot capture. This evidence helps decision makers understand quality of life, treatment sequencing, treatment burden, and the practical realities of living with disease and trying to maintain a good quality of life within your family and within community. This needs to be balanced as well with drugs providing value for money. Certainly in the UK, this is something that we discuss a lot. So advocates help translate what statistics actually mean in real lives and what this could imply. Policy change often begins long before legislation, and it begins by influencing the conversations that shape decisions. And that is why advocates must be involved early, before policies are finalised and opportunities for meaningful input have passed. Patients are not simply recipients of healthcare decisions, we're living them. We're living their consequences every day and should therefore help shape them. But at the same time, Successful advocacy means recognizing that policymakers, clinicians, and health systems all face competing pressures. Real change comes from bringing those perspectives together and ensuring that patient experience is part of the solution from the very beginning. And we can bring evidence directly to MPs. I've often written briefing sheets pushing issues such as access inequity, imaging delays, metastatic breast cancer data gaps, implementation failures, under-researched cancer like lobular breast cancer, and drug access concerns. So I think the practical advice here really should be understand the science, understand the system, be constructive, build relationships and collaborate, find mentors and or like-minded charities, because it is quite a hard work, and it is definitely worth having people supporting you and people around you that you can trust and gain from their experience. You need to be persistent. You need to suggest solutions, not only highlight problems, and keep always patient reality central. So I was talking earlier about some training, and I have, as I said, I've been supported by many charities to do my training, even from America. The National Breast Cancer Coalition, or NBCC in America, does an excellent training program called Project Lead, which you can apply for. And GRASP does an amazing online free live poster walkthroughs where research from the biggest conferences is explained in small groups with a mentor and usually the poster author themselves. It's an amazing opportunity, this, because you really get to ask any questions you like and have it explained in a really good way. And Europa Donna in Europe provides comprehensive advocacy training through their annual in-person advocacy training course and virtual sessions on the Empowered Learning platform. Independent Cancer Patient Voice, ICPV, in the UK does an in-person voice training in London. And our own National Institute of Health and Research in the UK as well does some very good training when you become a patient advocate on their research projects. So such programs as these really do equip patient advocates with evidence-based medical knowledge, communication skills, and advocacy strategies. I mean, one of the lessons I learned is that effective advocacy often involves understanding how decisions are made and then presenting that evidence in a way that decision makers can actually act upon. So you don't need to be powerful to influence systems, but you do need to become difficult to dismiss. I mean, advocacy is not about replacing clinicians, scientists, or policymakers. It's about ensuring that systems built around patients are genuinely capable of hearing what patients say. And when advocacy works well, it does not just change the conversations, it changes access to treatment, research, and sometimes survival itself. So never give up.
Well, thank you so much, Kirstin. That was a real masterclass, to be honest, in how to advocate and get your voice heard. I'm impressed. I think that Kirstin has just showed that you need patient advocates in the room, and patient advocates who are trained and who can work so effectively. So really, thank you so very much for that. Right, back to Fatima, who will now talk for a few last minutes, and we are running short of time for the Q&As, on what specifically clinician advocates can do.
Okay, so very, very quickly, from the point of view of clinicians, what can we do? So we can start by raising our voices about the importance of quality of care. We've been discussing about access to medicines, but it's not the only thing that improves survival, and quality of care is fundamental. I've also briefly told you that reimbursement policies for hospitals and physicians have not kept up with the science advances, and particularly in terms of different formulations, different regimens. And very often, and in many countries, clinicians are forced to offer suboptimal care. And when that's the case, I think we have to be brave enough to speak out. And I know that by personal experience, that if you speak too much, you may be punished for it. But I think if we speak, all of us, all together, like Kirstin was saying, then it's hard to shut all of us up. So it's important that we all speak up about what we are forced to do sometimes. Also, from our perspective, from the physicians, we have to adhere to evidence-based and to guidelines-based medicine, and not go with our private experience. And we also need to fight for the multidisciplinary care access for metastatic breast cancer patients. So what we can do is discuss all our cases in a multidisciplinary tumor board. What we should also do is make sure that everything that we prescribe is evidence-based, and we should inform, and I know this is, perhaps we can come back this in the Q&A, we should inform the patients of what is available, what exists, even if it's not available at our specific center, and help and see if the patient has other possibilities of being treated. And if the patient does not have, discuss with the patient and provide what I sometimes call the next best option, to make sure that you provide the best available high quality care. So we have responsibilities at the individual patient level, at the institution, nationally and internationally. And I know it's not easy, but we as clinicians have also to raise our voices.
Thanks so much, Fatima. We've got very little time for Q&A now, but we're going to go straight into the questions. So I'm having a little look at what there is in the chat. And I thought, should we start with the chat from WC, Walter? I can't see, I've got a piece of text over that. What he's saying is, can we move from a current situation? How can we move from a current situation where it's all about dollars and euros and geopolitical and MFAs and economic issues to a trilateral system where patients become the center and patient access is the currency? So that is what your goal is, and you try and have those conversations around that. Access is pursued as an objective and not an afterthought. Is that wildly fantasy, or is that something that is a meaningful thing to try and move towards? And there's no specific person, so anyone's welcome to talk to that. Maybe our Access Embassy, or maybe Mihai, I don't know.
So thank you, Anna. I'll try to give it a go.
Okay.
For me, it's exactly the concept behind our idea for innovation access on day one, because it's exactly what the proposal aims to do. Everybody has access upon regulatory approval, and then all the let's say arguments and the fights regarding how much does it cost, what is the evidence, what is the one, and so on and so forth. Those take place behind the scenes in parallel, and they don't, and we move away from all of these discussions leading to an access decision. Now, this also creates additional interesting incentives, because then I think at some point it's going to become much more difficult for a country to say, no, we don't agree in the end. It's going to be much more difficult for a company to say, no, we don't agree in the end, because it's much more difficult to create a situation where you have to withdraw a product because the company and the member states have not agreed, which also creates, I would say, creates more skin in the game, if you will, for the companies and the healthcare systems. And again, all of this while everybody has access on day one.
Christel and then Fatima.
Yes, and maybe to add to that, I think it's also very much like Kirstin also said, the lack of presence of patients in these debates. So I also saw a question about COVID and how we were able to provide access faster during that time. There has been a review of the legislation since then, but the amount of speed or the acceleration that we were able to realize was quite limited, to be honest, and still by far, very far from what would be needed. So somehow the debate needs to have a more human perspective and really needs to have the joint involvement of patients to show what the costs to patients are, I think.
Fatima.
So I just wanted also to raise the issue that we cannot solve, obviously, but that I find that the system we have currently is broken. And we can say that we will, put in the face of politicians and decision makers what is the cost of not providing access. But on the other hand, if a country is suffering financially speaking, economically speaking, it is impossible to pay certain amounts for certain treatments. And now what Kirstel it told us about the geopolitics is extremely scary for the rest of the world outside the US. There is no way, I am convinced there is no way that any European country or outside Europe would be able to pay those prices. And so what are we going to do? Are we all giving up on the new treatments moving ahead? It's also bad business, as Pat Garcia Gonzalez once said. It's bad business that you develop a drug and you only make it available for 10% of the patients that could benefit from it. So we have to rethink the whole system.
Right, I've got a quick question for Mihai. What are the timelines for the equity-based tiered pricing in Europe?
Thank you, Anna. So I saw that. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that because it's a collective action problem. It means that whichever member state moves first is is at a disadvantage from compared to their neighbors and their peers. So what we're doing, the way we are thinking about this, is that we're escalating this in our conversations with the European Commissioner for Health, and we're asking for a dialogue with member states so that this is basically a situation where everybody signs that everybody applies this concept and it's verifiable at the same time. Therefore, nobody is at a relative disadvantage. Unfortunately, we've been talking about this for maybe 2 years now. Every time at national level, we are facing this issue of, well, I don't want to be the one that is at a disadvantage compared to my neighbors. So I don't have a timeline. I think I would say hopefully during this commission mandate, I think we have discovered that the commissioner has been very, very attentive to the topic of access and to the topic of innovation in Europe. So we're hoping that this momentum continues and we're able to make some meaningful changes while he's still there.
Thanks, Mihai. Fatima, do you still have your hand up?
Yeah, I wanted to say that perhaps one thing where we could all unite our voices, and this is physicians, patients, pharma, and everybody involved, is on making sure that, and sorry to focus a bit on Europe, but on making sure that Europe works as Europe. Because if we look at Europe as a whole, we could be a market as big as the United States. So instead of the individual countries fighting alone, they should all fight together. Because if we do that, then we have a good counterbalance not to have the same pricing as in the US because the market is as big as it is. And maybe that will also reduce the gap between West and East. You saw in the chat a question on how patients in Kosovo are left with treatment sometimes for months. Left out of treatment sometimes for months. So in the metastatic setting, if you stop the treatment, the disease starts progressing and may kill you. So it's not something that you can stop and wait until it's available again. And maybe this is the sense of urgency that we need all together to pass the message to those who take decisions.
Thanks, Fatima. Can I take one really quick question now from the chat, and then we'll go to wrapping this up. And the question is, are the current access models actually reducing access gaps to innovative treatments, or are they working to increase those gaps? So quick one on that for any volunteers.
I'm gonna put Mihai in the spot on the spot because I already said that I think our models are broken. So
I would say that maybe they were good enough 20 years ago or maybe 30 years ago. But yeah, I don't think it is the case with the new types of innovations that we are seeing. It does seem that something is broken and it's a bit of a crocodile's jaw sort of situation where the situation is getting little by little worse every year. So yeah, I would say that maybe it was a couple of decades ago, but not anymore.
Okay, listen, guys, we've run out of time. So thank you all very much. Fatima is now going to introduce some key messages from this and what's going to happen next. So Fatima, could you do that before we have to wrap up?
Yes, so I will summarize what we've been saying and very quickly because you've been quite active on the chat. So, and you will see that this just takes take-home messages from all our talks. So build bigger coalitions, collaborate across diseases, organizations and stakeholder groups. And if I may say also across different cancer types, we will be stronger if we fight together. And okay, it's moving. So bring supportive policymakers into the conversation early. Create a shared evidence base and common narrative. We have to fight for the same things and humanize the debate on, like we've been saying, focus on the human cost of delayed access. And position access to medicine as a discussion point at your country's health, geopolitical competitiveness, and innovation agendas. Use online resources, interactive tools to find and customize data that will help you support your argument and will have most impact in your own country. Understand the science and the system, and for that is not always easy, but there, as you have heard, there are available courses and workshops and trainings that you can do, and also you can ask for mentorship and join an advocacy organization. Work out the best timing to advocate. Be constructive and persistent and bring solutions together with the patients. And like Kirstin said, become very difficult to dismiss. And Christel has also pointed out. For the clinicians, as I said, speak out. I know it's hard, but speak out when you're forced to prescribe what is not correct. Discuss with your patients all the available options and also bring your patients with metastatic disease to the tumor board. Or I don't know, Anna, if you want to say what we are going to do in terms of the toolkit, or if you want me to say.
Go ahead, Fatima.
Okay, so as we did with the first webinar, we will produce a toolkit, an advocacy toolkit, this time dedicated to high-income countries. And so if you have some ideas besides what we have discussed here, please contact us. In fact, contact Adele at the email that you see there, and give us your ideas, and we'll put all together in a toolkit that we will send to all of you who have registered for this webinar. And please take a minute to complete the short survey about the webinar.
That's it. Well done, everyone, for almost sticking to your times. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you.